Hey, you guys, this is Raven. I hope you guys have been enjoying this very intriguing series on the man God appointed and anointed. Parts 1 through 3 were about King David, his infamous transgression, his true character, and God's promise to him. And it's just as much about like faith and doubt, fear and courage, love and hate, shame and honor, pride and humility, loyalty and betrayal, acceptance and rejection, obedience and rebellion, elevation and demotion, forgiveness and vengeance, as well as like bravery and jealousy, the shedding of innocent blood and redemption. And all of this came about as David had a relationship with God, Israel, Saul, and his son Jonathan. So, although it was about David, it's kind of, well, I wouldn't say hard, but it's kind of hard to talk about him without talking about King Saul. Their lives intertwined. So, as I studied to prepare for part 4 regarding King David, there was just so much area and some chapters that focused primarily on King Saul. So, I didn't want to just make, part 4 really long. So, I decided to do a man God appointed and anointed, King Saul, because he also was appointed and anointed by God. He was Israel's first king prior to David, who became his successor. So this lesson is going to be focused on Saul leading up to his demise. It starts off with 1 Sam 28:1, where we learn the Philistines are preparing for war with Israel. Ashaph, who is a Philistine and who had given refuge to David while he was, fleeing from Saul, tells David that he and his men must go to battle with him. And so David in 28:2 reminds Ashaph that surely, he must already know about what David's capable of. David was quite sure he had heard of how many that he had slain with God's blessing. So Ashish responds with putting David in charge. In 28:3, we're reminded that Samuel the prophet was dead and that Saul had put away all of those with familiar spirits and wizards out of the land. So as the Philistines gather together for battle, Saul gathers with Israel. When Saul sees the host of the Philistines, he gets scared just like Israel did when they seen Goliath. So in 28:6, Saul decides he will seek the Lord, but the Lord doesn't answer by any means, not through dreams, not by Urim or by prophets. And so I was looking at that word Urim and I'm like, what's that? So I looked it up and it's like lots or stones that are used by high priests to determine God's will. So it was typically on the ephod of the high priest, and it was often accompanied with thummim, another stone. And so you had on this attire something that hung like a necklace, so to speak, that had 12 stones on it. Each of them represented the tribes of Israel. And then you had these two other stones that was the Urim and the Thummim. And that represented like where you would get that insight from when you would use it to seek out God's direction, basically. So the Bible refers to casting lots or stones like they did to see where the tempest came from, and it fell on Jonah back then. So one signified light and fire, and the other meant perfection, completion, or truth. And one or both of them had light that would illuminate from them. So you can ask a question basically, and it would let you know yes or no, or guilty or innocent, as seen in Joshua 7:14-18. And so this has often been mimicked by the world in using a crystal ball or oracle or orb, or when wizards or witches use stones to cast lots. So if you do a search and put in Trump, Saudi Arabia King, orb 2017, either in the search engine or on YouTube, you'll see a picture or video where Trump, the King of Saudi Arabia, and the Egyptian president placed their hand on an orb or oracle during a May 2017 visit to Saudi Arabia. I know a while back, I don't remember what year it was, but Saudi Arabia had given citizenship to a AI robot called Sophia. You could pretty much Google that. It was all on the news when it occurred. And so when they put their hand on the orb, basically the AI video was activated, and then this AI voice starts talking. So it was kind of weird. But at any rate, when I read Urim, it reminded me of that picture, and I actually pulled it up and saw the little like light object, that they had their hand on during that time. Casting lots in a secular way is like when people was drawing straws, or if they flip a coin and agree and agree to something. Or like some people in the world would use a Ouija board to get an answer, or similarly to casting lots when it was revealed in Jonah. So they pretty much seek out the dead basically to learn about, whatever answer they want to go in. So basically, as I was saying, Saul did not hear from God by Urim or dreams or the prophets. So we already learned in verse 3 that the prophet Samuel had already passed. And so he's like, he's stuck. Like, what do I do now? God's not answering me. And so we see different ways where whatever God does, we know the devil will mimic. God has prophets, the world has fortune tellers. God's people prophesy while the world makes predictions. Since Saul no longer has the prophet Samuel, he's no longer in league with David because he had been seeking to take his life, and God didn't answer him by any means. He decides to get a servant to go seek out someone with familiar spirits. He had gotten rid of all the wizards and those with familiar spirits, but now he's seeking one out. So Saul is an Israelite. He's the first king of Israel. He's a member of the tribe of Benjamin, who is the youngest of Jacob's sons. So he knows that he's not supposed to do this. I'm sure he must have been familiar with God's word on the matter. In Leviticus 19:31, it said, "Regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek after wizards to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." In Leviticus 26, it says, "In the soul that turneth after such as hath familiar spirits and after wizards, to go a whoring after them, I will even set my face against that soul and will cut him off from among his people. In Deuteronomy 18:10-12, there shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, which is a seer or a soothsayer, or an oracle, or clairvoyant, or astrology. These consist of people who try to gain hidden knowledge or predict future events through natural means outside of God, or an observer of times, or an enchanter or a witch. Verse 11 says, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer, someone who practices black magic. In verse 12, for all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect, that is to say, upright or sincere, with the Lord thy God. Verse 14 and 15 goes on to say how the people of the land he will give them to inherit look to observers of times and diviners. But you, the Lord thy God, will not have you use these things, and that he would raise up a prophet, and that's who they should listen to. In Isaiah 8:19, it says, and when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God, for the living to the dead? So we see just by these few verses that God's people are to engage in those methods the world uses. No fortune tellers, no mediums, no sorcerers, no psychics, no palm readers, no tarot card readers, no crystal ball readers, no oracles, no orb, and so forth. The people who do such use demonic forces or black magic or dark spirits or occult methods. We have our faith and his word to rely on when we need answers and direction. So we see words like Urim or lively oracles in Acts 7 verse 38, and that reference is Exodus 19:3. Also we see in Romans 3:2 the oracles of God, and then 1 Peter 4:11 and Hebrew 5:12 are other references. In 1 Samuel 28:7-8, Saul's servants tell him they have found a woman. So he decides to disguise himself and put on different apparel. We all know generally a king is distinguished from others by the type of clothes they wear, the colors of the clothes or that's in the clothing, and other accessories. So he doesn't want to be recognized, so he decides he's going to put himself in disguise and go to this woman. So he goes to this woman and asks her to bring up a familiar spirit of the name that he'll give her. And so in verse 9, the woman naturally is concerned about her life because Saul had already put all the people with familiar spirits and wizards out of the land. So she's like, why are you trying to put a target on my back by asking me to do this? You know what Saul have done. Now, mind you, she doesn't even know this is Saul who she's speaking to. So in 28:10, it says, and Saul swore to her by the Lord. So he didn't put God into it. He said, and Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. Personally, I'd be too scared to tell someone to do something I know God spoke against and then tell them that there won't be any consequences for the wrongdoing. Further, like if someone told me to do wrong, and God would not punish me for doing wrong, that's not something I would trust. I mean, that wouldn't even sound right to me. Like, I want to know who they were and what authority they had to ensure me that there wouldn't be no consequences. But after he says that to her, she decides to do it. I mean, she, like I said, she doesn't even know who this man is and how he has the authority to assure her of such thing. So in 28:11, she asked, "Whom shall I bring up unto thee?" And he said, "Bring me up Samuel." You know, that already should have been a red flag right there, because you're asking me to summon the prophet Samuel up. I mean, I would think she would already know that when he said, "Bring me up Samuel," that it would click in her mind that he's talking about the prophet Samuel. And the reason I say that, because he had just died. They had just like mourned him publicly. I mean, so it had to spread around that the prophet had died, and they were publicly mourning him and fasting. So I would think that would have resonated with her, but at any means it didn't. So in 28:12, when the woman sees Samuel, she cried with a loud voice and spoke to Saul, asking, "Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul." So, with divine intervention and through Saul's disguise, he's exposed. And so, Saul tells her not to be afraid and then asks her, "What did you see?" And so she said she saw gods ascending out of the earth. And then Saul asked her, "What form is he of?" And she said, "An old man came up, and he was covered with a mantle." And a mantle was something many prophets wore back in the day as a sign of their calling from God. And we see in 1 Samuel 15:27 that Samuel had a mantle. We also know that Elijah wore a mantle and passed it to Elisha. So even after Samuel's physical death, she saw him covered with a mantle. That kind of gives us a glimpse into life after we transition, as well as what follows on to reveal even more. So the verse goes on to say how Saul perceived it was Samuel, and he stooped his face to the ground and bowed himself. So basically, he's giving reference. And in 28:15, it says, "And Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up?" And so disquiet means to take away peace or tranquility. Biblically, agitation of the soul, loss of peace. Like when people pass, people say rest in peace, or they say RIP for short. So Samuel is at peace, and his peace is interrupted by Saul having the woman with the familiar spirit summons him. So Saul goes on to tell Samuel that he's in great distress because the Philistines are making war with him in Israel. God has departed from him and wasn't responding to him anymore, neither by prophets or dreams. So he called on him to see what he should do. And so I just thought this was a trip, because God is not responding to him, period. Not by dreams and Urim or a living prophet. Throughout the text, we don't see repentance to God. We don't see attempts to right his wrong. And now he becomes desperate, and he makes it worse by seeking someone out with a familiar spirit. So in 28:16, I mean, now this is a scary thing. Samuel's like, "Why would you ask me if you know God has departed from you and become your enemy?" In 28:17 and 18, Samuel reminds Saul of what God had said through him while he was physically alive, how he had taken the kingdom from him and given it to his associate David because Saul had not been obedient to the voice of the Lord or executed his fierce wrath upon Amalek. So this is why this is being done. So I want you to pay attention to this. So we get to the next verse, 1 Samuel 28:19, that says, "Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Did you catch that? I don't know if you caught that, but the Philistines are ready to battle Israel. Saul's afraid. He reaches out to God. God doesn't answer by dream, prophet, or Urim. So he seeks out a woman who has familiar spirits, goes to her in disguise, since he has already cut off all those with familiar spirits as well as wizards out of the land. Ask her to summons up Samuel, who's already died and publicly been mourned, and Samuel, after transitioning from life on earth to life in God's glory, is telling a scared Saul that God has become his enemy because he disobeyed him, that God would now deliver Israel into the Philistines' hand, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. And also David had said in 1 Samuel 26:10, "As the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or the day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish." So now, we seeing this come to fruition, where even Samuel, the prophet Samuel, is on the other side. He's already transitioned. They mourned his death, and he's telling Saul, tomorrow you and your son's going to be with me. So we get to verse 20. After Saul hears the words of Samuel, it said he fell straightway full length all along the earth and was very afraid. He had no strength in him because he had been fasting all day and night. So the woman sees that Saul is greatly troubled and offer him some food and drink, and he refuses, because she's like, look, you came to me, I listened to you, now I want you to listen to me. Eat, drink, so you'll have your strength. So after a while, his servants and the woman kept telling him, you need to eat, you need to eat. And not in those words, but, trying to get him to eat something and drink something. And so he decides to go ahead on and eat and drink so he'd have strength for this battle. And so after he and his men drink, they rise up and they left that night. And so chapter 28 and 30, they deal with David. And so that will actually be included in part 4. So chapter 31 continues with Saul and his men and the Philistines. So 31:1 starts with the battle of the Philistines against Israel and the men of Israel fleeing, some wounded. 31:2 and 3, the Philistines fiercely follow after Saul and his sons, killing Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchishua, Saul's 3 sons first. Then an archer strikes Saul. So in 4, Saul doesn't want to be abused by those he refers to as uncircumcised. So he asked his armor bearer to draw his sword and thrust it through him. So he'd rather his armor bearer kill him as like a mercy killing and die with honor than to be abused and killed by the uncircumcised Philistines. But his armor bearer is too afraid and doesn't feel comfortable, obviously, and he wouldn't do it. So Saul basically took a sword and fell on it. So we get to verse 5, and upon seeing that Saul was dead, his armor bearer does likewise and fell on his sword and died. So in verse 6, we see where Saul, his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all the men that was with him died on the same day together, just as prophet Samuel had told him when he sought out that woman with the familiar spirits and summons him in 1 Samuel 28:19. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. And so now they're on the other side, as Samuel said, with him. In 31:7, and when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley and those on the other side of Jordan saw that the men of Israel fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they left the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in those cities. So, in looking at this, and I mentioned this before in one of the other parts because it happened during that time as well. When you look at today, we can see from the past how certain wars have been fought and how lands and territories become occupied. We still see battles for land to be reclaimed and occupied. So some came to possess land after wars and conflicts. And so when you defeat somebody, you take over that area. So now if you look at today, people, if they took your land by way of war and they lived there for so long, they're not willing to give it back up. They perceive it as their land. And then the other people are like, that was our land, so we're coming to reclaim it. So then you got this war going back and forth on this, over this territory. So we even see that back then, that after the Philistines, killed that part of those people of Israel that was with Saul, they took over, they possessed that land. So now we get to 31:8-10. On the following day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen. So they cut off Saul's head and stripped off his armor and went to the land of the Philistines to broadcast it in the house of their idols and among their people. And they put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. So this is similarly to what David did when he cut off the head of Goliath and took his sword and things and kept them securely. It was pretty much a common practice. For one, it shows that that person has been defeated. This person is dead. 2, it puts fear in others, like, hey, we killed this person, and then that kind of puts fear in those. Also, in doing so, you're celebrating the killing and you're bringing humiliation to those who have been slain and their people. So, it was a form of mockery, to put fear in one, to show that person had been dead. So, had been defeated. So that was something they did with Saul and his 3 sons. And so in verse 11 and 13, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard about the Philistines, heard about what they had done to Saul, the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall. They brought them to Jabesh and they burned them there. After they burned the bodies, they took their bones and they buried them under a tree, and then they fasted for 7 days. As I was saying before, initially I was doing the series The Man God Appointed and Anointed about King David, but his story involved another man, King Saul, who was appointed and anointed prior to him and was Israel's first king. After doing part 3, as I started studying to complete part 4, like I said, there were so many areas that just primarily dealt with Saul and his battles and his personal demons that he faced. So I figured I would isolate this portion in between part 3 and part 4. And also, like David, Saul was also much greater prior to his transgressions against David and his disobedience to God. So this portion of Saul was only highlighted because it intertwined with the man God appointed and anointed about King David. And so this actually concludes the segment on King Saul, and part 4 about King David will follow. If you haven't listened to any of the series, The Man God Appointed and Anointed, I suggest, listening to parts 1, 2, and 3. And please listen to those and stay tuned for part 4. I hope these lessons are blessing you and glorifying God. They've been blessing me as I look at two different men who God appointed and anointed, and to see how great these men were, but also that they were human. They have flaws. They got, looking at Saul, he became jealous of David. At first, he was just enamored, as I said in another video, about King David. Like, he just loved him some David. And when he heard the women singing, oh, Saul have killed tens of, men or hundreds of men, and David, these tens of thousands of men, that put jealousy. That's where jealousy entered his heart, and it became a thing, and he just couldn't deal with that. He felt like at some point they're going to look more to David than him, who was king. And so he spent so much time chasing David, trying to kill David. And David had a couple of opportunities to kill Saul, but he chose not to. He kept saying, that's God's anointed. I can't bring myself to kill God's anointed. And so that's the heart of David. This was a man after his own heart, which is the reason why I started the series in the first place, because too often we look at one transgression of individuals instead of their body of work. And David was so much more than his transgression with Bathsheba. And Saul was so much more than, the transgression he was committing against David and the disobedient he had with God. And so, as I said, I hope these lessons are blessing you and glorifying God. Amen. God bless, and stay tuned for part 4. Thanks for tuning in.